So welcome everyone to the first focus series of 2026. If you're joining us for the first time, it's great to have you here with us today. I wanted to start by just talking about the purpose of the focus series is to continuously elevate client engagement. So we run these sessions once a month for 30 minutes where we focus in on one aspect of Asset Map or enabling a specific conversation or looking at new features that have launched so that you can practically incorporate that into your client's engagement approach. So just some housekeeping. We are recording the session. We will share that with you afterwards. Betty is here on the chat, so any questions that you have throughout, please just post them on the chat. We'll answer them throughout, and we'll have some time at the end as well. But let's get to today's topic. Today, we're focusing on enabling engagement through frameworks. Now, if you have attended one of our framework or advice framework webinars in the past, this will be a nice refresher, but we are also introducing a new framework today that you won't have seen before. So we'll be sharing that with you. Please stay on till the end. Right. So enabling engagement through frameworks. Let's start with why. So if we think about frameworks, why frameworks? If frameworks are used by lots of different professions, lots of different industries, got two famous ones on the screen here, the APGAR scoring chart that is used by doctors when babies are born, and the OODA loop that is used by fighter pilots, when they're taking on fire. And the reason, these industries use frameworks is just when you are in high pressure environments, emotional environments, using a framework or having an approach that allows you to systematically work through it, stay calm, stay in the moment, and work through a logical approach to take that step forward. So the APGAR, how doctors use that is they work through these steps, looking at the appearance, the pulse, grimace, activity, and respiration. But they don't go through it once. They go through it once and score it, and then they go through it again 5 minutes later or 10 minutes later so that they can see how the baby is progressing. So it's great in that pressurized environment to really focus in on, okay, well, what is the process? What's the approach we're going to follow to make sure we're highlighting everything and not missing anything? Similar with the OODA loop, that's used by fighter pilots when they're being fired at. They don't know if they're upside down or right side up. And so they need to take an approach where they can really focus in. So they observe, they orient, then they decide, and most importantly, they take that next step, they act. And that's used also in business, that we can observe, orient, decide, and act. So if we think about these frameworks that are used in these industries, why does it work well? And I'm not necessarily suggesting that we're in the same pressurized environments, but if you think about financial planning, we're dealing with lots of clients, we're running businesses, looking at compliance, it can be a highly pressurized and emotional situation depending on where the client is in their journey. And frameworks can help us too, like it does in other industries, just remain in the moment. Let's talk about frameworks specifically from an advice frameworks and in financial planning. What can they help us achieve? And the first is that it allows us to have consistent engagement. If we think about the amount of client engagements we have in a day and the mental load that we carry with all of these engagements around, I've got to talk to them about this, I've got to understand, where they are with that. We could have hundreds and thousands of questions going on in our mind that we want to work through with these different clients. And we're not only dealing with clients, we're also running businesses, making sure we're compliant, looking at our tech stack. There's a million other things that we're looking at as well. Using frameworks in our client engagement process can help reduce that mental load. We can focus in on, I'm going to go through the same approach. It's repeatable. It's comprehensive. It'll make sure we don't miss anything with clients. And I can take all my clients through that same approach. But what's powerful about it is even though we're going through the same approach, it's going to elicit a unique conversation. Now, I can use the same framework and engage with 5 different clients there and have a completely unique conversation with each of them. So it really gives us the ability to be present in the moment of where the client is, knowing that I can let go of all of the other things I'm thinking about and just focus in on this framework and working through that step by step, because it gives us a logical approach but most importantly, it's that unique engagement. What comes out for the client will be unique to them and where they are in their journey. So advice frameworks, just to summarize, gives us a uniform approach to that consistent personalization. And if we think about, if we talk about advice frameworks, the first one I want to talk through is something we call the 3 E's. And this is a framework, but it's also an outcome. And the 3 E's stand for explore, educate, and elevate. Often when a plan is created, that first asset map for a client, they'll say, okay, now I've created the map. Now, what's the conversation that I have with the client? And this framework just helps us, keep that in the back of our minds. Every engagement, we want to explore with the client. We want to educate on any gaps there might be. And we want to elevate. What is that next step or progression that this client can take to move forward? And, interestingly enough, about a year or so ago, Australia released new legislation for financial planners where they said after each engagement, you need to document and prove how the client is in a better position post that engagement than they were before. Now, that may feel a little bit daunting, but I think it's a great way of saying in every conversation, we want to take a step forward. We want the client to be just that little bit better off each time. And the asset map is like, often we refer to it as a treasure map. If you explore that with the client, you can gain insight into their journey, how they got to where they are today. It really is just a snapshot of their experiences, the way they make decisions, their journey, and everything that led them to where they are today. So exploring the map and educating the client as we work through that, and then elevating. And we're going to go through a couple of frameworks now that help us to do each of these things. So how do we explore with the client? How do we educate? And how do we elevate? Well, there's a few frameworks that can help us do that. The first one is the 5 whys. Then we have the 4 frames and the 6 L's. So these nice and easy to remember, 3 E's, 5 whys, 4 frames, 6 L's, and they all help us to explore, educate, and elevate. But let's start with the first one, the 5 whys. Now, I apologize if you've heard this story before, but this picture that you see here is from a TV show. His name is Detective Columbo, so let us know if you've seen it. But the premise of the show is that he's a detective. He would go in and interrogate potential suspects, but he had quite a unthreatening, disheveled sort of appearance, and he'd go into these interrogation rooms and he would start asking the suspect questions, and they would think, okay, I've definitely got away with this. He has no clue that it was me. And then as he would walk out of the room, he would turn around and say, just one last thing. And that would typically be the question that would just unravel their story, and, they would then, be the suspect. So I'm not at all suggesting that this is what we want to do with clients. It's obviously not an interrogation, but the purpose of this framework is about asking 5, or at least 5, powerful, intentional questions. So if you're looking at a client's map in preparing for a client engagement or in the session with the client, think about what are the 5 questions that we can ask about what we see on the map that is going to help us understand the client better. It could be, tell me about the people in your life. Or if you see an income block, and the client is employed, tell me more about the role you play in this company. That could open up a conversation around how long they've been there, what their career plan is, whether they plan to retire from there or not, whether they're happy or unhappy, and how they've got to where they are today. So it's about asking really intentional questions. Another famous one is asking about, rental property or second property that a client has. Often we think if a client has a second property, that's something we can bring into the retirement planning later, if need be. But often when you ask that question, tell me about this property, there's a huge emotional connection. It could be that, they've had that's been passed down from generation to generation, and that's something they want to leave to their kids. But the point is just asking that question intentionally with curiosity to understand more can help us unpack, how the client makes decisions, what's important to them. If they've got specific investments, what sits behind that for them? Is there a specific intention with that? And just help us explore with the client where they are today. So, we talk about 5 whys, but I find the question why can sometimes be threatening or defensive. Clients might get a bit defensive and say, why do you have this particular investment? But just switching that to tell me more. Tell me more about this particular investment, or tell me more about these people in your life. It's just an open-ended question that allows them to share with us, what that means for them. And we often, equate this to if you walk into someone's home for the first time or their office, you'll often see, photo frames or pictures of family or a trophy cabinet with, different trophies or awards. And we typically ask them about that. But we're asking with that genuine curiosity to understand more, to understand them more. And we want to approach this framework in the same way. We want to look at the map as that trophy cabinet, as that picture frame, the treasure map, and ask intentional questions to understand more with that genuine curiosity. So this is a great way of exploring. It's, a great, that first meeting, doing it with the map, talking through everything that you see on the map, and even asking follow-up questions. There's the rule of asking it 3 times. If you ask the same question 3 times, is it, what comes, does something more come out? And just actively listening at that moment, being present in the moment and really listening for what is important to the client. And that'll help us in those next steps of education and elevating. Yeah. So that's the first framework, 5 whys. The second one I want to work through now is the 4 frames. And this framework was inspired by the fact that when 2 individuals look at the same asset map, different things come up for them. And it's just amazing to see. Have an asset map. We always say, show one other person in the office the map before you go engage with the client and ask them, what do you see when you look at this asset map? And it's incredible to see how we all have just different frames of views, different lenses that we look at the map with, and how that, raises different things. So this is about being intentional about that. Looking at the map from 4 different financial planning frames, looking at it from an investment point of view. If I'm solely using an investment lens, I'm going to start looking at the map and looking for things like, are we targeting the return that's required? Is there consolidation opportunities? Are there changes we need to make in the investment space? Then looking at the map from a legal perspective, here I'm looking for structure, what sits under the individual versus what sits under the business or the trust. Is it optimally structured? Is the will in place? Are there other contracts that we need to review with the client? If I'm looking at the map from an insurance point of view, then I'm going to look for things like, are they, sufficiently covered for some of life's unforeseen events? What about things like if they've got a business, is the buy and sell in place? Is there a key person? What are the things I should be looking at there? And if I look at it from a tax perspective, then I'm going to be thinking about, are they optimally structured between retirements and discretionary investments? Are there changes we can make that would help them from a tax perspective? This framework is great, in preparing for client engagement because it helps us look at it from these different frames. But it's also a great framework to take clients through in the meeting, because then they start to experience, okay, this is what my planner is doing, looking at my financial picture from an investment point of view, from a legal point of view, from an insurance point of view, from a tax point of view. Even if we're at review stage and the client's plan is in place and we can tick, all of these different metrics, still exploring that with the client, sharing with them, helps to educate them around what are the different things we're doing, why are we structured the way we are, what are the decisions we've made, and what are the things we need to elevate. So it's great for education, it's great for elevating, but it's also great for communicating to clients in a way that they can really understand and experience the value that we add. Okay. And I know you're doing all of this already, but it's just to have that framework, have that systematic approach in engaging with the clients. So that's the 4 frames. The next one is the 6 L's, or the financial fire drills. It looks a little similar to signals, so I'll talk a bit about that. But this framework was inspired by a fire drill. So I think we've all had that experience of going through a fire drill. It's practiced a lot in companies and businesses. And the reason that we do that is because when a fire happens, it's chaos. you know, and we want to make sure everyone is aware. This is the process we follow. This is, you know, where you go, what stairs you take, who does the roll call, where we all meet, so that everyone is on the same page, that when that happens and it is chaos, that we know what the process is. We know what the plan is and how we're going to follow it. And this framework is to bring that into financial planning, to say what are the fires or unforeseen events that could happen in a client's life, and how prepared are we for each of them? What is the plan? And does everyone know, the planner and the client, on the same page with this is our plan in the event of these things happening? And it's nice and easy because they all start with L's. But the first one is liquidity. You know, if someone in the household were to lose their income, what is the plan? You know, do they have emergency funding, or is there easy, you know, investments or debt to access if they need be, or does that plan require changes? What if there's a disability in the family, somebody becomes disabled? Are we aware of our plan then? Or if there's a loss of life, or someone becomes ill, or we live longer than expected, you know, and this is a great conversation to have, not just from a planning point of view, but understanding the family and what that will look like if someone lives longer than expected. And then legacy, you know, is it all in place? Is the will up to date? Does everyone know who gets what, or what that process will look like? Again, these are the fires, the unforeseen events that could happen. And we want to make sure that we have a plan, that we make changes if need be, but most importantly, that everyone understands what that plan is. And signals is a great way of just quickly showing a client, you know, if they're red, amber, or green across any of these events, inviting them in to understand, you know, these are the potential things that could happen, the unforeseen events. Let's work through it together and understand what your needs are in those, you know, for those situations, and whether we have a plan in place. But another resource that you can use to enable this conversation is found on the reports tab for all clients. It's called the Financial Fire Drills and 6Ls, so you can generate it for any household. And it gives you a document that you can work through together with the clients. So this works great to actually sit in front of the client, open up their asset map, open up this document, and work through it systematically. And start with, you know, liquidity needs, and say to the client, show me on the map, what are we going to use if something like that happens? And then they can sort of point out, no, I know it's this emergency funding, or I'm actually not sure what we do in that event. Let's see if we need any changes, and let's document that together so that we both know we're on the same page. That's the plan for that. So you can work through this document with the client through each of these steps and just note, what is our plan? So that, again, you can see how this is a framework that helps with education, because the client starts to see, okay, this is how these different things on my map are being used, when they'll be used, and what the purpose of that is. Okay. All right, so those are the three frameworks that we use for exploring, educating, and elevating. It's that, you know, the outcome we want is the 3 E's. We want to explore, educate, and elevate using the 5 Whys, using the 4 frames, and using the 6 L's. But as promised, here's also a new framework that we're introducing today. I thought with the addition of priorities towards the end of last year, and also please note that priorities is now also in sidebar, so you can view them there, you can expand them from there. It's a great way to check in with the clients on their priorities and whether any changes could be made. But I thought this was a good time to introduce a priority setting framework. You know, often when a new client approaches us, they're either referred by someone or they have a specific need, and they come to us with that need very much top of mind. You know, it might be, I need life cover, or, you know, I need to review my retirement plan. But they come to us with that need. And then, you know, at that point in time, we have to meet that client where they're at in terms of what is top of mind for them. We can't, you know, if we start trying to expand and explore other priorities, they might be quite fixated on, this is the one I need. So the very first step in this priority setting framework is uncover what is top of mind for the client. What are the things that are keeping them up at night, or they're just thinking about, or the reason they've approached you? Let's first uncover what that is. And an example of that, with life cover is asking the client, okay, well, tell me more about this desire or need for life cover. What made you decide now is the time? And just by asking that question, the client might share, well, a family friend passed away and they've just realized there wasn't anything in place and it made me think about my own situation. Or there will be uncover what that story is for the clients and how they got to this point. But document and capture first what is top of mind for them. The next step in this framework is creating calm. So how do we reassure and acknowledge that that is top of mind for the client? Because in order for them to sort of move on or expand their priorities, it may not be their top priority, but it's the one that they've come to you with. It's the one that's top of mind for them. We need to start by reassuring and acknowledging and unpacking, what is that specific priority? What sits behind it for them? What would their need be with that? And only then can we start moving to exploring broader priorities. So step one, capture, uncover, and then reassure and acknowledge that we understand, have that empathy of this is the top of mind for you, and we will address that. Because then, and this may not all happen in one engagement, but then we can start to consider, we can start to invite the client to explore broader what other priorities they have. For example, okay, now we understand your need for life cover. We understand what sits behind that for you, what, that emotion that sits behind it, which could be, in that case, fear. And we're going to address that so that you feel it's in place and everything is taken care of. But now let's explore what other priorities you may have. What about in the event of disability, or let's look at retirement, and we can start exploring broader what the client's priorities are. Then the next step is clarifying. And this is where we want to really refine those priorities and prioritize them. And by refining them, we want to use the words the client uses. So in other words, if the client says, I want to do a trip with my family to Europe, we want to word the priority exactly like that, and document it like that, because that creates that connection, that emotional connection to, yes, that's what I want to achieve. So refine and prioritize that broader list. What are we going to do first? What is of utmost importance? Has it changed any of our priorities? And then we can move forward. Then we go to connect. And this is a really important step when defining priorities with a client, is connecting it to an emotion. Often if we have a priority of, for example, going on that trip, the emotion we can connect to that is that feeling of joy, or it could be a feeling of accomplishment, or a feeling of being organized, or, whatever that emotion is, we want to link that to the priority, because that's what's going to drive and encourage the client to want to achieve that priority. And then lastly, but probably most importantly, we want to celebrate. So as a client reaches those specific priorities or milestones in their journey, we want to acknowledge and celebrate that. Again, that creates that encouragement to achieve more of them, but we want to celebrate and connect it back to that emotion. So this framework is great to use for new clients when we're exploring priorities with them, but it's also great to use for clients at review stage. To just work through those same steps, I want to start by just uncovering, is there anything top of mind for you coming into this review? Let's make sure that we are capturing that we are reassuring and acknowledging that particular need. Now let's explore, these were all the priorities we had, and the importance of them that we connected to the last time we met. Are those still the right ones? Do we need to make any changes to those? And can we reconnect to the emotion and celebrate the ones that we have done? So just to give you an example of that, in priorities, you can now capture them. What's great about this feature is you can really put in the words the client is using. So there's the family trip to Europe, and even add in that emotion, whether you add it in as a word or even an emoji, if you feel like that's appropriate or the client will relate to that better. Add that in, so that when you're generating the report, the client just connects. Yes, these are the things I want to achieve. Those are the emotions I want to create. And then I can move forward. All right. And that brings us to the end of today's presentation. I think the key thing here is thinking about going into 2026, going into, the reviews for the year and new client engagements. What are the one or two frameworks that you're going to bring in that really help you just explore, educate, and elevate with clients? So thank you very much for joining.